left office in 1908, and then in 1909 he went on an African safari. You know, he was a big hunter and all that kind of thing. You know, I'll tell you more about Roosevelt. He goes to Africa. Morgan says he hopes that the first lion Morgan beats does his duty. In any event, but this culminates in what we all today, because we're all certainly old enough, and it's the foundation of our historical memory to the degree we have one. Everything culminates in the New Deal. And we have this labor insurgency in the 1930s during the Great Depression, and a president willing to single out people he calls economic royalists, right? Tories of industry. He promises to drive out from the temples of our civilization the money changers. This is the language of a president, right? We don't hear this kind of, we haven't heard that kind of, but this was common enough language, right? Talks about how he uses Brandeis's phrase, the abusive use of other people's money. And so what we get here is a kind of culmination of a long century of resistance to the power of the street. Some of that resistance failed. The populace were powerful as all get out, but they lose in 1896, and nothing comes of all that they had tried to do, right? Other movements, like other reform efforts, like the New Deal, succeed so substantially that it took more than maybe 2 generations, but they've managed it now, to undo what the New Deal had done. That is, to regulate not just the financial sector of the economy, but to in general establish a kind of public surveillance over an economy that we all depend on to live. That was a victory, right? So there have been victories, there have been defeats, but there's always been, call it underground, but it really wasn't underground, a tradition of American resistance to the power of the street. So those who say it's somehow alien to the way we've lived don't know what they're talking about, or they may know what they're trying to say, and we'll get to that a little later. The second point I want to question, it's like an accusation question. People say, Occupy Wall Street is very naive. Very naive. They're just kids, they don't know anything, they don't know how the street operates. Very unsophisticated movement. I went to the march. I went to the march on October 5th. There was that first big march from Foley Square, I don't know if you remember it. And at the march, I saw a young woman with a kind of corrugated cardboard sign on it. She had scrawled a magic marker, one word, repeated 3 times: system, system, system. That's very sophisticated. That's very sophisticated. Beneath all the thickets of political verbiage about tax this and cut that, or what I really love, that new missionary in our midst, the job creator, what nerve. You know, never before, who's the last businessman you came across who thought of himself as a kind of missionary out there creating jobs? Let's be real. Okay, beneath all of that, there's a system. And these presidents, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, Roosevelt, Wilson, Roosevelt again, were looking at something systemic, just like Occupy Wall Street did. You know, Karl Marx, let's get down to it. Karl Marx once said that high finance is the Vatican of capitalism. It's diktat to be obeyed by everyone. And we know that is true today. Oh, very, very true today, yes. What these presidents were saying, now, today these presidents, we know, would be called closet Marxists, right? And we know that because you say things far less inflammatory than malefactors of great wealth and chasing the money and get called a socialist. So we know they would be called closet Marxists, all of them. But that would do a disservice both to Marx and to the presidents, because they were not. And they were, let's also be honest, slave owners, Indian killers, imperial bullies. They were all these things. But, however, They were aware that the problems the country faced had a location, had a systemic root. They wanted to get to the root of things and do something about it, change it. And that's, in that sense, they were keyed into the fact that finance, from the first time America becomes a kind of agrarian capitalist economy in the early 19th century, through its industrialization in the late 19th and into the 20th century, and into, of course, our own era of financialization. The power of finance is enormous to control what goes on, and it has an enormous influence over the well-being of the economy and of the lives of people. And this, so that today, and for the last 30 years, this Marxist notion that high finance is the Vatican of capitalism has been never perhaps more quintessentially true than it is today. And you don't need to be a Marxist to believe that. You need to either look around you or listen to a guy like James Carvin, right? You know who he is, right? This sort of pundit, pontificator, Clinton advisor, right? Not a Marxist, I assure you. Said back in the late 1990s, right, when all this kind of financialization and financial deregulation was well underway, he said the bond market intimidates everybody. He said that, right? And he, of course, is right. I'm not going to weep over Berlusconi leaving office. That would, I'm not going to weep over that. But think about it. It is incredible that two governments have been replaced. How much we might like, certainly in Berlusconi's case, the fact that he's gone, by people who were elected by nobody, represent nobody, right? Have never served in any elected government. They run the governments of Italy and Greece. That's extraordinary power. That is a Vatican. That is a Pope you do not disobey. And it's sophisticated of Occupy Wall Street to have noticed that and to have brought our attention to it, to focus us on that phenomenon of our current life, and to remind us that if we are suffering now new levels of poverty, mass foreclosures, credible unemployment, environmental degradation, infrastructural collapse, and in a word, a grim future, it can be traced back there. And that's why you occupy there, and that's why all of those movements have found a home there. If you go there, or been on these marches, all of the movements, whether it's about housing or the environment or unions or jobs, they're all there because they sense that brilliant insight that Occupy Wall Street has had. And the second one is the 99%. It's so simple, isn't it? But it also tells us something so basic. You know, for a long time, this is so amazing. For a long time, part of that long century, it wasn't self-evident to people that capitalism and democracy went together like love and marriage. They didn't think that. They were worried about the opposite. They were worried that the tendency of kind of large-scale corporate and financial capitalism was to undermine democracy. And that's what the antitrusters and the populists and the Knights of Labor and the socialists and so on were about. They were saying there's something antithetical here in the logic of the system that threatens our real democracy. The 99% reminds us of that question. Maybe there can be. The New Deal seemed to civilize capitalism and restore a kind of democratic oversight, right? But now it's gone again, and look what it's left us with. A system that is so clearly run by money. Nobody can doubt it. Nobody can doubt it. And you know, there were a billion hilarious signs to that effect at these Occupy Wall Street demonstrations. There's just one other point I want to make about who's naive and who isn't. Who are the inept ones here? Who are the inept ones?
Bankers.
Yeah. In other words, this economy is in ruins, right? These savants These wise men, these wizards produce this. They are the ones, they are the financial misengineers whose ingenuity created this vast array of financial derivatives and subprime mortgages and credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations and subprime. And you know what? They were so sophisticated, so incredibly sophisticated, that they were done inventing them, and then they misfired. They didn't understand what was going on. They couldn't figure it out, and everything collapsed around them. So I find it hypocritical for those who turn to Occupy Wall Street. I understand everybody says they should raise demands and programs and so on, and I agree with that. Eventually, I think things will move in that direction. But let's start with where we were, nowhere, and see what they've done to get us someplace. And we can worry about programmatic this and so on later on. I should mention, by the way, the delegitimating of this Wall Street elite has happened once before. They were treated exactly this way as great savants in the 1920s, right? And they had solved the business cycle. There was going to be a kind of permanent plateau of prosperity. They were lionized by politicians and by the media and so on. And then came the Great Depression. So this has happened before. I want to get to my third. I'm probably going on too long. Let me get to my third accusation question about Wall Street, and that is this. And here, look, I would have been arrested today. Had this, I would have been. I would have. Had this not been happening tonight, and Phoebe's like, I couldn't have Phoebe. I would have been. So the accusation is that Occupy Wall Street is law-breaking. And, and it's not just a nuisance. I love it. It's disruptive. It's a nuisance, right? The economy's flat out. That's not that much of a nuisance. But Wall Street, they're making too much noise. But they're law-breaking. They're law-breaking. Today there were, I don't know, zillions of cops down and you couldn't even, this is about democracy, you couldn't even walk on what are supposed to be public streets. There was no cars, so it wasn't a question of making way for cars. You could not block them off, huddled you into little confined claustrophobic areas, and then, you got arrested or you left, and so on. Actually, I'm a historian, so I don't really care what's happening now. I don't know what's happening. Actually, Occupy Wall Street is probably the most law-abiding movement in the whole history of occupations going all the way back. Let me tell you a little bit about occupations. We have huge unemployment, and it's terrible, and people lament it. But they also take it for granted in a certain way. What I mean is they think that unemployment is a natural, unavoidable part of the way we live. Maybe it gets too high, that's bad, and we need to do something. But it's part of the facticity of everyday life. People didn't always see it that way. There was a time in antebellum America when unemployment didn't exist. Why? It didn't mean life was great and everything. People lived hard lives. They worked hard. Their material standard of living couldn't match our own. But they weren't unemployed. They were what today, this is an anachronism, what we would call today self-employed. That is to say, they had little shops, handicraft workshops, farms, and so on. And that is to say, they had the material wherewithal in their own possession with which to survive and reproduce their families and so on, right? And then something happened. And when it first happened, it was traumatic and shocking. I don't want to go on at great length, but